You guys want to debate soda and pop? What do y'all say?
Yeah, do let us know. It's good data.
Yeah, we must know this research. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to another episode. We are excited, so excited that we aligned our teacups aligned for no reason. Before we get started, though, we have an amazing guest to the side of us, so let's have him introduce himself.
Hello, all. My name is Jeffrey Kreustel. I am a holder of a linguistics bachelor with a minor in German. I have an AAT in history as well as sociology, and have always had a fascination with just things that were not from where I am from. So I have lots of random information on things globally, just overall. But I'm very much happy to be here and very appreciative to be on the show.
Appreciate you for being on, Jeffrey. So, with linguistics and obviously having a background in just a lot of information, we're talking today about languages. What is a language? How important is a language? Is it easy for someone to pick up a language at a young age, at an older age, and then ultimately, why is this all important? But before we get started, for all of us to be on the same page, what would you say is a definition of language?
So a very good definition that kind of covers all of the basics for a language is any system of communication that shares information that's conveyed either through a written system, a system of speaking, or one that we typically forget, a system of signing. So this is gestures with hands. Uh, I don't have much background in ASL or other sign languages personally. I've only taken 2 semesters, so I'm not going to claim to have much rigorous information on that, as that's not my specialty. But there are lots of resources, and if you are interested, I would say definitely go look more into that. But I will always nod towards sign speakers because that is just another form of language that we can communicate with.
Definitely, that's the key word is a communication, being able to transfer information that is from your knowledge and giving it to someone so they can receive it and understand that same information.
That's absolutely the case because we are a social species. We have been for hundreds of thousands of years. That's actually how we have survived all the various things the planet has thrown at us. And so to be able to communicate information means that we don't have to encode our information in genetics for the next like offspring to know. We can teach it to the next person. And on top of that, when written down, we can teach it to generations far removed from our own. A great example of this is look at the inscriptions worldwide that were done by people tens of hundreds of years ago. I mean, we have the beautiful copper salesman review from Sumeria. So like that's 5,000 years, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But it is that communication aspect in which you can impart your information that you know to another individual without having some biological mechanism behind that.
Definitely. And we talked a little bit before getting into the episode, but we talked a little bit like how a language becomes a language. So can anyone just pick up a language and just say, all right, this is a language. Now everyone can talk, say this, communicate in this way?
So languages can be tricky, as we don't know when the first spoken one occurred. But we do know that languages typically occur in families, and those families can have some things that are related, but languages will change with isolation and geographical distance. Um, in any given country, you can find a dialectal continuum, which is language or dialect A will be slightly different from B, slightly different from C, slightly different from E, but A and E will be different enough to almost be unintelligible. And it's just because of the geographic distance between all of them. And as that happens, if enough time passes and enough miscommunication or non-communication between the groups occurs, you end up having separate languages. Uh, Prime example that most people will likely be familiar with is French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, and Romanian coming out of Latin. So classical Latin was spoken different between like 100 AD or 100 CE and then 300 CE. And then by about 900 CE, the beginnings of all of those languages I listed earlier were already taking place to the point where we could say this is when these languages became distinct enough to be considered their own languages. So that's only a 600-year period between 300 CE and about 900 CE. And then you can have languages that pop up in a much shorter time period. If you have a bunch of individuals that come into contact with one another that do not share languages, sometimes a communication system known as a pidgin will form. And in this system, they will use the base grammar of one language and then word stock from another to cobble together some form of communication between them. If they have children and these children grow up to speak this as their native language, we classify that then as a Creole, and by that point it is a language because you have people using this in everyday usage. This could be going to the doctors, going to the market, going to school, going to talk with family members or religious leaders. And that's another key part of this is that languages need to function in certain roles in public. You can have diglossia and triglossia in which two or three languages are used for certain aspects of public and those aspects only. And you have this weird harmony that from a monolingual sense looks weird, but is actually very common globally. Uh, and with that point, it just again, languages become languages when they're no longer intelligible with their dialects, or in the
Hmm.
case of a pidgin, when native speakers are using it for daily life in general.
Makes sense. It seems like when you speak, like you're speaking the language, you're speaking the language enough to a point where other people are starting to speak it, and then eventually it just becomes its own little section,
Yeah,
more or
and it
less.
it can be as simple as uh, say this one village decides to use a different word for a base item, and then 20 years later they add a couple more words on top of that, and then suddenly they're slightly changing the way the verbs are pronounced. And as enough of those accumulate over time, they will then begin altering the entire language, and then it becomes different enough from what village 20 miles down the road was saying.
It's kind of crazy. Just let that geographic, that difference in distance can make on a language. I remember a one of my teachers, this was an American Sign Language class. We were learning about linguistics, and that was my first linguistics class I took. And he made a comment on just the language. The language involves the culture, the aspect, the human interaction, the communication of it, and that brought up the debate on sign language. Does sign language have its linguistics? Does it have its grammar? How do we know this nonverbal communication is a language? So it was just really cool to see just how in depth a language, or at least a pidgin or a dialect, can be for it to be classified in that category.
Well, absolutely. And I know in the regards to like ASL specifically here in the United States, I believe it was the 1830s is when they began teaching ASL or begin cobbling together the system to form what is modern day ASL. And it wasn't until 1963 when a linguist was like, hey, wait a minute, there's actual grammar here. It's not just spoken English being signed. That's 133 years that
Long
people
time.
dismissed this because they didn't understand that this was indeed a language. And
Yeah.
it showed that it had its own grammar that was separate. There were certain conformities that the speakers had, and the grammar and well, not so much the grammar, but like the vocabulary did change over time. I had a professor at my community college who grew up learning sign in the 60s. And he would show us, yeah, here's how the question words used to look like, and here's what they are now. And it was that simplification over most of it, even. And it was just impressive to see that, like, even in this man's lifetime, I mean, he was in his 70s, it had changed enough that he could demonstrate here's what I remember learning as a kid versus what I teach students now. So it's like, it's one of the big universals that, like, language always changes. There's never a point in which a language will stay static. Well, I'll take that back. If they're a dormant language, they will stay static because there are no living speakers to continue the progress of change on the language. But any like vibrant modern language will continue to change constantly. I mean, we can even see it in the like slang of millennials versus Gen Z versus Gen Alpha, and probably very soon Gen Beta as well. I mean, I don't know much about the Skibidi series, but I know it's very popular among those that are slightly younger than me.
Yeah, you're really not missing much, but
I think they'd argue that one.
yeah, I'll take that to my grave. You're not missing much. Yeah, no, this even the slang, that's a big thing. I'm gonna be honest, I remember us being in America most of my life and learning just only English and then eventually sign language. There's a little bit of slang with English, a little bit of slang in sign language, and then eventually I picked up some slang in Spanish. So I didn't really think much about slang or at least shortened words in other languages. And that wasn't until I went to Germany, hearing certain words that are local words, you can say. A big one is azul. That is
Yeah, yeah. No, the
that's
my
something
mom's
I picked
region
up and I still
uses the
use to this
same.
day.
Yeah. Well, I know too. It's like if you look at the word for morning in Germany, it changes a ton depending on where you go. And so it's like the standard version of it, which is what the government has decided is the dialect that'll be used as the lingua franca or the language of communication. The standard word is morgen for morning. So you say guten Morgen. But if you have like an individual from, say, Hamburg up in the north, they'll say moin moin.
One. Huh.
Whereas like for my mom's region, you'd say gamoya. And then it gets completely replaced when you go to Bavaria and they'll say servus. So it's just three different locations in Germany that are very different from each other. And this is just saying good morning.
That's pretty interesting because they're drastically different from each other. I know, and kind of going back with the US because that's the only I know so far.
No, you're
Um,
good.
just saying hello. You used to say hello or hi or what's up. And the South, we say sometimes even in certain parts in the South, we say howdy or we say how's it going? Just it's very different. So it's crazy.
Well, I know too, it's like I run the panel at furry conventions when I attend on constructed language, and I'll use real world examples of rules of language that all of linguistics has agreed upon, which it's a social science. Getting us to agree on anything is an impossible feat. But they managed to get five of them, and one of them is that intrinsic value is on every single level of change because it amplifies something. And my favorite thing to do is ask my audience, what is your generic term for a sweet carbonated beverage? And in the five times I have run this panel, I have had at least one person say Coke at four of them. At which point I'd be like, "You're from the South, ain't you?" And it was, yeah, because that is their term for generic carbonated beverages. Most of the people either say soda or pop, and there's maps that can show this. But the South is unique in that they'll say Coke. So if you go into a rest stop, you'll ask, you can say like, "Oh, I'd like a Coke." They will then ask you what kind instead of just automatically giving you a Coca-Cola. And to me, it was just fascinating that something as small as just a soda is that way. And it's fun too to explain that like for the soda versus pop debate, it's because of the term soda pop, which was original. Certain areas took the first half of the word, certain areas took the second half. And that's where that soda and pop divide happens now. And this is something that just plays out in real time in US culture.
Like there you go. If you guys want to debate soda and pop, what do y'all say?
Yeah, do let us know. It's good data.
Yeah, we must know this research. With just the language and all that stuff, there's been a debate. Maybe it's not even a debate. Just being a teacher, this is something we talk about a lot. In the United States, we're one of the few countries that doesn't teach a secondary language until high school, if not even that college. And that's a whole conversation on its own. But there's an argument that children learn language quick. It's easier for kids to learn language at a younger age. However, other teachers and professors have mentioned that it's easier for adults to learn a new language. So the question becomes, Is it easier for a child to learn a second language or a new language or an adult to learn another language?
Based on the psycholinguistics course that I had taken and just the understanding of the human brain, and I'd say a good chunk of the research that falls into this, it is easier for a child. Much like it is a lot easier for a child to learn to ride a bike than it is for an adult to learn to ride a bike. And the reason for this is because of the numerous critical periods that our brain goes through in which we will trim the endings off of our synapses in our brain. That's part of puberty that happens there. We trim a lot of these excess synaptic connections to streamline our brain. So if you have these language pathways mentally before the synaptic pruning, your mind will recognize that these are important and hold on to them. If you do not have this, you will later in life need to either redirect existing neural pathways or put in the time and effort to create new neural pathways in your already optimized brain. It will take more effort. It is a bit more frustrating as an adult if you have not had those pathways preserved from childhood, but it isn't impossible. It will take a little more time, a little more effort, and you will need to work with communities of practice and self-monitor a lot more. But it is doable, and this is something that I tell everyone. Don't be discouraged if you're an adult trying to learn a foreign language. Lots of adults do it all the time. It's just a little more effort. So, my stance is that yes, it is easier as a kid than as an adult, but it's a monumental task regardless.
It is indeed. It is indeed. I mean, being a math teacher, we say this to students all the time that math is a language. It's just you're learning new vocabulary and new literacy,
Mhm.
new information, and having to translate foreign information so you can solve a problem.
Oh,
And it's
absolutely.
you can see the kids struggle just because they're having a hard time understanding what a slope is, what the axis is, a rate of change, where you, instead of just saying all those fancy math words, you can just say the line is here and it goes there.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I quite recall take calculus BC in high school, and there was a point in which we had a math problem that had no numbers, and it was an interesting point to reflect back on. It's like, we've gone from 3 plus 3 equals 6 to what is the integral of like sine cotangent, like sine x cotangent x. I think there was some extra piece that goes on the end of it, but it was just like, man, how did we get here?
yeah, it's like all the math, like you ask all the math majors, like, why did you major in math? Like, I love math, but then there's no numbers. So now I don't like math.
Yeah, no, yeah, stats was nice. It was just numbers.
Yeah.
You have the formulas there, you just plug in what you need and you're good.
Yeah, there's no theory, no nothing. Just
Yeah,
what do you have? What are you given? Boom, answer.
absolutely. But unfortunately, life likes to be complicated, as in the case of languages, because
Mm.
unlike math, sometimes it's not very logical why certain things are the way they are. Take a just a reflexive look at English spelling, solidified in the 1500s during a vowel shift. That's why OUGH has like 8 pronunciations.
Yep. There's two ways of spelling gray. There's different ways of saying read,
Hmm.
homophones, homographs, all that fun jazz.
Yeah. And then our stress timing patterns, those are again, hadn't taken linguistics, wouldn't have ever noticed it, but we have word pairs where it's the same spelling of the word, but we stress different parts of it depending on if it's a noun or a verb.
Yeah, like read and read, correct?
Not quite. So if you have a convict that stole something, you convict them.
Hmm.
So you have convict versus convict. The stress is on the second half for the verb, but on the first half for the noun.
I'm today's years old to realize that there's exactly the same spelling.
Language always does things like this. This is why we have linguists.
It's like underappreciated, underrepresented, but definitely appreciated.
Well, it's
No,
a lot like the beautiful joke where it's two fish. One of them asks them, "Hey, how's the water today?" And the other one's like, "What are you talking about?" You're so inoculated against thinking about language that it is difficult sometimes to even get the conversation going because you have to front load with so much information to then begin talking about language. And it
mm,
is difficult in a classroom of monolingual students because they have no frame of reference, whereas those that have taken other languages can then be like, oh, it's like this thing from X language.
mm. That's true because once you're picking up a second language, there's certain vocabulary, certain terminology, and even different neurons that your brain has received from learning the second language. So you're able to make more connections because of that.
Well, I know too, it's just you begin to recognize the patterns a lot easier because, like, for example, in French and in like later Spanish and other languages, you have to understand what's a direct object and what's an indirect object because in the case of French, they really like their pronouns for it. And there's a specific pronoun that goes with the direct object and another one for the indirect object. And so you'll have a sentence in which you can have like je le lui donnais or je l'ai lui donné. And it's like I gave it to him kind of deal. And it's like this is reference to something else in a sentence elsewhere, but it's the fact that like they will always refer to the pronouns in a sentence because it's easier to say instead of saying like uh, j'ai donné le cadeau à Marc. I gave the gift to Mark. This je l'ai lui donné. And it's like French loves that. So you had to know that. And then it's like later when taking Latin, it was, oh, you need to know what's a direct object and an indirect object. It's like, oh, French gave me this. I got this on tap. Let's go. Or with like Arabic, Arabic has a nominative accusative system for its nouns. And it's like, oh, so this is like case from German. So it's you pick up things that are then shared in other languages that make learning those other languages a lot easier, but you need that first one to help you understand the rest of them.
That is true. Someone told me, I think it was the same professor that I took for ASL linguistics, that once you learn a second language, unless it's sign language, but that's something different. If you learn another spoken language, there's a higher chance you're able to pick up another language just because of those pattern recognitions.
That is the case, and I'd say it's probably well from a neurologic standpoint, your pathways have been created mentally.
Mm.
So on top of being able to understand the patterns and pick up on those quicker, you also then now have the ability to have the mind focus on what it needs to then store that information.
We're talking more about the brain, the neural pathways, just about the language. And part of the language, going back with the communication, is speaking it or at least signing it. It's a little easier with signing, obviously, because it's a lot more fine motor skills than vocalization. But speaking a language um, requires certain tongue movements, requires a bunch of physical attributes that we don't really think of, obviously, when we're speaking. It's second nature. Kind of going back with the fish that
Hmm.
what are we talking about? What water are we
What's
in?
water? Yeah. But yeah, no, there's subfields of linguistics that deal on how does the brain figure this out? How does the mind assist in the coordination of your tongue and vocal cords to produce what you need? I know, like my professor for psycholinguistics, Dr. Lott, looked at aphasia, and that's how does brain damage affect your way to communicate? Certain areas you can comprehend what's being spoken to you, but you cannot comprehensively communicate back. In the other area, it's you can't understand what's being told to you, and you just blurt out comprehensive like word salad, basically. You don't know what they're saying or can gain communicative effectiveness from it. but they can't register that they are not uttering anything intelligible. And it's just impressive to see how damage to slight areas of our brain can cause these in that regard. But one thing that underlies all of it is that like there is that desire to communicate. And it goes back to again, we are social creatures. We like to work in teams and with others. That's how we get things done.
Yeah, it's true. Even if we're not using a language, we're finding a way to communicate. Like with coders, a lot of times it's just sending emails, sending messages. I'm not
Hmm.
a coder, so obviously that's probably not what y'all do, but the point is
Well, it's
communication.
even with that though, there is a whole field of computational linguistics that looks at the languages that we use to interface with computers. I mean, I never got into coding personally, but I've done my fair share of modding for Minecraft back when you actually had to drag and drop code into places. And it's all written to tell the machine execute this thing at this time with this like resource to get it done. And it's a massive dance for all the code monkeys out there. We very much appreciate the work you do because Lord knows us that go with spoken and sign languages can't fully understand that sometimes. But that's the whole thing is like you're talking to the machine. You are communicating with the machine. And that is still, you are communicating.
Yeah.
There's a desire to communicate.
I think there's a movie that came out. Well, there's a lot of movies that talk about robots expressing feelings. I'm kind of curious if that's a reason why a lot of people like movies like that, where a robot is learning how to function in the world, and there's obviously that lack of awareness, but that desire to connect with someone.
I think that may indeed be part of it. I think another aspect of it, and this is something that like, I've seen many times in like the HFY subreddit, uh, it's that like again, because we're social creatures, we want things to communicate with, even if that means that we have to create the other to then communicate with. Uh, in these stories, it could be uplifting a species, finding a galactic community to be a part of, creating sentient, autonomous intelligences that can be on the same level of us. Now, granted, they paint us usually in a much rosier picture than current things going on, but I mean, it's good to have that hope, especially when things don't look too bright.
Yeah. People get scared. It's scary out there.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
So
But I
this
think, uh, sorry to interrupt, here might be a good point to pivot towards the state of foreign language teaching here in the United States.
you read my mind. I was just about to transition into that. So we talked about it earlier. The United States is we're one of the few countries that doesn't teach a secondary language up until later on. And there has been conversations on why it's good, why it's bad. What is your thought on what the United States has decided on not teaching a second language up until later on?
In my personal opinion, I think it is a detriment. And from the standpoint of what actually goes into it, it sadly makes sense as to why we don't. But it is frustrating nevertheless. As for my personal opinion, I am of the belief, personally, that as kids are learning English in grade school, they should be taught ASL hand in hand, in addition to a localized language. Now, granted, for Los Angeles County, that could be one of like 224 languages. Spanish is a huge prevalent one, and I highly recommend that people would learn Spanish in Southern California. I know I had to inadvertently. You gotta know how to get those quesadilla tacos.
If you want the good stuff.
Absolutely. But to that end, that's my suggestion is you should be knowing at least three languages when you exit primary school, or at
Mhm.
least being comprehensive in it by middle school. And this is because it's good to be able to communicate with minority groups in your region. And on top of that, you may be in situations in which I can line of sight see you, but I sure as heck can't hear you. And this was something I recall vividly from like UPS and FedEx. The machines are loud. not everyone knows how to project their voice, but I can see you and I can sign to you. So I've always constantly been like, hey, why don't we look into ASL gestures, print out a little sheet, and give them to the employees so that they can communicate through line of sight and hand gestures than trying to yell over the machines. But to return to like the reason as to why we don't, currently there are only 11 states in the entirety of the United States that have a graduation requirement for high school to study a foreign language, at least a year. And that is at minimum. Some states, like California, require two, potentially three if you're going for a UC for college later. Certain colleges will have their own requirements to learn foreign language. I know for linguistics, we had to take, I believe it was 4 semesters of one language and then 2 semesters of a non-Indo-European language.
Interesting. That's very specific. That's non-European, Euro language.
So for me, my non-Indo-European languages that fell under the like requirement would have been Mandarin and ASL. I took only a semester of Arabic, so it didn't quite count, but I had had 4 semesters of German and 4 years of French. Uh, so those had counted as well for that. But they state non-Indo-European because then we get an idea of things outside of the European family of languages, or families of languages, I should say. There are three. And it was very informative because it's just a different system. It expands your horizons. And that's something that, again, languages help do. Because, as you stated earlier, there's the cultural aspect. And so, on top of learning a language, you're learning about the culture. And this was heavily prevalent in both like the Arabic and Mandarin classes that I had taken. But the reason that they aren't so heavily pushed is because Americans typically have to go very, very far to try and encounter a location in which English is not the dominant language. I know again for Southern California, we're lucky. We have certain parts of Los Angeles or just a quick 2 hour drive down to Tijuana in order to immerse ourselves in an area in which language that is spoken in the streets is not English. But like for me here in the PDX, the Portland metro area, I really have to search hard to find things in which English is not the language. And even then, English is still in the background. If I'm going to the food truck down the street with people from Nayarit in Mexico, I can speak to the people behind the counter in Spanish, but there'll still be some people having English in a conversation nearby. Or if I go to a particular delicatessen that is a German themed deli, I may hear people in the shop speaking German, but the people behind the counter don't. And so it's like English is still omnipresent. And that can dissuade a lot of people because you need a community of practice. And this is something that even in my community college they had discussed was a problem. How do you get people to practice a language outside of a classroom? And then there is, the recession of '08 cutting funding to a lot of liberal arts programs, which unfortunately languages fall under, despite the fact that it would help us economically and politically on a world stage. So this is something that even the State Department has had issues with. They had put a plan together after 9/11, but because of the '08 recession, they've never been able to fully up what they wanted to. Because believe me, they want people to do this. I mean, heck, there's dual immersion schools for preschoolers and kindergartners all over the place. There's a French one here in Lake Oswego. Uh, so like there is the desire for it. It's just it's hard when English is the dominant language everywhere and is considered the lingua franca globally.
It's also interesting too, because United States, it wasn't an English language at first. If you date all the way back around the colonization era, we had Native Americans. We spoke, and we didn't even speak one language. We all spoke our native tongue. It's
Hmm.
so yeah, native tongue. So it's very interesting. Just fast forward to now, we're looking to branch out to just English, and it's true. I remember when there was a time I was learning Mandarin and German at the same time because I got bored.
As one
And
does.
yeah, like let's just learn a language instead of scroll on TikTok. And I noticed it was not as complicated learning Mandarin because I was in Monterey Park for a good chunk of my life, and that's very Mandarin heavy.
You have the culture
And
there, the practice.
it is, and but German, not much at all. And I was looked at pretty funnily as well because people were like, "Why Germany? You're not going to Germany." But that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Well, I
And
know too, it was the same thing when I decided to take French in high school. It's like there's no French speakers nearby. And it's like, well, there's Ontario, Canada, and then you learn A, they don't speak Parisian, which you're learning in the classroom, and then B, it's only a couple of them in terms of like the overall population. But I think too, it's like in that regard, we have a lot of timidity when it comes to practicing our languages with native speakers. This is something I've noticed with a lot of people, in which it's like they'll know a given language, but they don't want to practice it because they're afraid of making a mistake. Whereas my whole thing is that I don't care if I only know how to say, hey, I speak this language not very well in very bad grammar. I can still get my point across and it'll make the other person smile.
mm, someone told me when I was in Germany, it's better people Germans will treat you much kinder when you ask sprechen die English instead of saying, "Do you speak English?"
Mm-hmm.
And most of when I did that, most of the actually all every single time a person one of the a German individual approached me, and it was conversation needed to be done. They said, "Oh, just a little or not much at all," and they would just cut to the chase, like, "Hey, what do you need?" So it
Mm-hmm.
was just really nice to be able to do that. It's like I want to learn, but sprechen kein Dutch.
Well, I remember too, it was like I had a study abroad 2015 in Paris, and this was literally just after I had taken 4 years of French. And it was to the point where like I would be, I think my favorite part was I was in the train station trying to buy a ticket, or no, I was on the train itself talking to the conductor, and I was like, "Hey, here's this. I'm going this way," and I just hit a point which like my vocab ran out. So I asked her like, "Hey, would this be okay if we switch to English? My vocabulary is out." And she looked at me funny. It's like, "Wait, what? Like you're not from here?" And I'm like, "No, sorry. I know like I've taken a lot of French, but yeah, sorry. We're at a point where I need English, if that's okay." And there were like multiple times where people would ask me like, "Oh, where are you from?" And it's like, "Oh, the U.S." Back in 2015, that was a shocking thing. Nowadays, don't know if I'd want to say that I am American. But it's that kind of thing where it's like there's a lack of community of practice for us to try and use these languages that we spend time, effort, and money to learn. And then it's just difficult if there's no minority group near you to
Yeah,
justify the usage of it. And for most parts, Americans don't earn enough to go to other countries, to take the time off from their jobs in order to travel to then use this. And even then, most other countries will just default to English.
naturalist shit.
Regardless, though, if you are intending to go to a country, please learn some phrases. It will get you way farther than, as you put earlier, just walking up and like, hey, you speak English? At
And
least just, yeah, learn a couple phrases. That's all we're asking, just a couple.
just to save yourselves to make the rest of us Americans look good.
Yeah. Well, it's like if you're gonna at least learn a couple phrases, learn some culture too. That's always handy. Learn some customs, learn some things that may or may not be against the law, so that you don't make an
Stay
ass
oppressed
out of
for a long period of
yourself. Yeah.
time.
We have a reputation. I won't say if it's good or bad, but we have one, and maybe it's something we want to improve.
Yeah, there is a reputation for sure, but that's for the country's perspective to see in us.
But for the most part, to answer the question of like why does the US start so late? We focus on other subjects earlier. We don't put the funding into it because we haven't deemed it to be profitable. And as such, 11 states have a requirement to learn a foreign language before you graduate high school out of 50. Um, and I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
No, especially with everything going on right now, there's so many other priorities, and to this day, I don't know many. Well, I'm not very familiar with politics, so this is even a rough statement for me to say, but I don't recall a politician talk much about education, except like removing things. So. It's
It's either removing them or opting for like the choice, which means usually charter schools to defund the Department of Education, which, as I'm sure you as a prospectful teacher know about, and then as well as my ideals of eventually joining those ranks, we kind of need it. So it is somewhat frustrating to see them trying to dismantle a great service that our government does, but it just means we gotta fight.
that is true. And if we things don't work out, there's always another solution. So as teachers and as individuals in general, we have that choice to make a difference, to change and learn. At the end of the day, that's kind of the whole thing with even with just learning a language.
Well, just as communication is key, community is just as important. We are social creatures. We pull through when we work together. So find a group, help out. We'll ride it out.
There you go. And with that, that ends our episode. So if you guys have any questions, put it in another language, challenge yourself. In all seriousness, if you have any questions on different languages, there are tons of resources. Being in the United States, we have a lot of freedom, and there are communities that want to learn as well. So get yourself uncomfortable, and as always, stay curious. And PSA, pass a smile, stay safe, always be awesome. We'll see you all next time.